All right. Hello and welcome to Treasury Talent's LinkedIn live chat with a Treasury practitioner. Today's guest is Drew Wolff. Drew is the former treasurer of Starbucks and he has a broad finance background. He's currently taking a year's sabbatical before making his next move, but today he's going to be joining us to chat about his career, his views on networking and relationships, and much more. We do have questions we'll be asking Drew, but this is also your chance to ask questions to Drew as well. So Scotty's monitoring the conversation. He's currently on mute. He's joining us as well as Simon. And please feel free to drop any comments or questions, and we'll be sure to get them answered for you. So with that, Drew, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Great. Happen to be on the Big Island right now. So aloha to everybody, and sending warmth your way wherever you are in the United States.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. I think we were talking a little bit before this. I woke up to -9 this morning here in Michigan, and I will take every bit of that warmth that you want to send this way. So very jealous of your current location. Simon, let's kick it off. What do you have?
Hey, Drew. Good to chat again. You've had a pretty varied career spanning the military operations, finance, both corporate and banking, and you've sat in both the CFO and the treasurer's seat. What have been some of the highlights along your career in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to start right now to, I talked many times in my career about taking a sabbatical with my wife, and, things just never lined up. And this year it did. This is all pre-COVID, luckily. And I had many ready successors. I gave Starbucks a 5 months heads up, and despite the year of global pandemic, it's such a privilege to be able to take a sabbatical like this. So, that's a highlight. But going back to the Starbucks experience, certainly my last role was CFO of the International Division and Channel Development. Seeing how the Starbucks brand came to life outside the United States, I mean, it was just fantastic. The quality of the partners and just really the premium level of the brand internationally, which is even higher than the US in some places, was a highlight. I'm going to my treasury experience. So I was treasurer of Starbucks for 3 years, and it was my little detour from finance to the treasury, which I loved. And we issued the first of its kind bond, a sustainability bond, which is a green bond plus, but it also has social characteristics. And it was the first one of those kind to be done by an investment grade corporation. And after that, the ICMA published standards for what makes it something a sustainability bond. So that was a highlight. Going to my career in retail banking, I went through the global financial crisis at Barclays in London. That was a case where the division I worked in, the retail bank, it was a recovery. We were already turning things around by the time the financial crisis hit. So that was a highlight in terms of my experience then. Now, little did I know how close the larger bank almost, came into almost going out of business. But we definitely had fun in the retail bank. As customer service was getting better, we were taking market share. And then, going to my early part of my career, like you said, I started out as a submarine officer. Came out of Annapolis, out of the academy, and it's just unique, right? It's just a chance for some one of a kind experiences that you'll never be able to replicate. So I certainly remember, most of the time you're underwater, but when you surface and you're transiting somewhere and you're on the bridge, and I remember driving down the Red Sea and around the corner of the Arabian Peninsula, being the officer of the deck on top. It's pretty unique, and so that was a highlight. But just to tie that back to Starbucks, I was a executive sponsor for our Veterans Network and Armed Forces Network, and really a part of our veteran military spouse hiring program, and seeing the positive impact that had on Starbucks was great. And so, I don't know what the numbers are now, but Starbucks has hired 30,000, veterans and military spouses in the space of about 4 years. So really executing well.
That's phenomenal. And I mean, I think conscious capitalism is the phrase that comes to mind when you talk about that sustainability bond and that program for veterans. That's amazing. So now, with the benefit of looking back, and if you could speak to your 22-year-old self, what's the one piece of advice that you would give the younger version of you that you'd also want to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I think I would tell myself to, especially working in big organizations, to spend more time horizontally building relationships and networks. Frequently you get into some kind of vertical silo and you're very focused down, and then obviously managing your boss and you recognize that it's important to build networks, but I would have put more time into that. And really, you got to take care of your vertical for sure, but the power of networks and your exposure to different groups and how that can help you in a big company, I think I would put more time into that.
Yeah, so along those lines, I mean, it sounds like your approach to networking and relationships has kind of evolved as your career has evolved a little bit more, and you've learned some lessons along the way. Can you dig a little bit deeper into how that's evolved and really, as you moved up, how you kind of went horizontal and broadened those horizons and how that benefited you?
Yeah, I had a great boss for many years, Dan Oppenheimer, and she would use the term, Drew, you've got to have social skills in a social media world, which is so true. And so it means your approach to networking is not transactional. It's not short term. You're investing. You may not see the payback or any payback, right? And so I think that's been my approach. It is very much like a social environment, like you were entertaining somebody at your house and vice versa. And sometimes because it's business, we think of it differently and much more transactional. And then on the mentorship front, I would ask the viewers, are you mentoring somebody or are you being mentored? And what's your answer to that? And it doesn't have to be a term sheet. It doesn't have to be formal. In fact, frequently it's not. And so at any one time I could say, yeah, I'm being mentored by a couple people. I'm mentoring a couple people. And it's never mentor mentee. It's really mentor. I'm getting as much from them as they're getting from me. And I can think of some people over my career that were way outside of finance or whatever, and I was mentoring them, and they really sought somebody outside of their vertical silo, which I think is another point. And I have a friend, Craig Kiesler, for example. He's a strategy guy at Target. He was at Starbucks, and we still keep in touch. And so I think, going outside your vertical can be really valuable too. And you just, have coffee a few times. You don't have to sign a contract.
Definitely. I think that not being formal is the key thing there, Drew. Like, people think they have to be formal, they have to be programs within your organization. I think from all the people I speak to, I think those informal, relationships that you have are where you get the nuggets and where people tend to have the best career advice.
Yeah.
Well, Patrick, Drew, you've had a really successful career, obviously getting to that CFO international and channel development role. What would you attribute that rise to the CFO and senior finance ranks to throughout your career?
Well, I would say personally, I never put boundaries on. Somebody asked me to do something, I did it, and I really sought to learn the hard stuff that nobody wanted to bother with, and just as an individual contributor, like once you're an expert on something in a company, people seek that out, right? And usually takes some work, but not that much. But frequently people tend to they learn the lingo and the lexicon, and if you really pull the string, they don't really know what they're talking about, usually because it's not a fun topic. So seek those topics, seek the broken processes, seek the jobs nobody wants personally, and that'll lead to things. And then once you're a leader, I think I always ask people, how do you define your leadership approach? And sometimes people have various forms of answer, right? There's a million ways to answer that question. But most importantly, if you consider yourself a leader, you better be able to define it. And whatever that is, whatever works for you. Now, my approach, and I got this from David Marquet, who wrote the book Turn the Ship Around. He's an ex-submariner, so this works for me. But there's tons of top 10 leadership books and whatever. This is very simple, and it is, give people control. You think frequently early in your career, I got to be a leader. I got to step up. I got to take charge. I got to take control. And further I get into my career, the more I'm like, no, I need to give control and step out of the way. Now, for that to work, there's two things that need to be in place. And one is that people that work for you need to know, everything that you know. And they need to know what the CEO knows, and they need to be completely organizationally aligned. And the second would be they need to be competent, and they need to have the tools and the knowledge to do their job. But as a leader, then, I can work on that. I can focus on those two things. And that's about all I can remember. But if I focus on that, and that's the irony, like if you focus on the people, you'll be fine. Then I've taken the next step and I've defined, okay, how does that feel? What are some adjectives that work for me? How does that feel, to work for Drew? And, I've come up with some words that mean something to me, but I also think that's important. So my guiding adjectives are passion, presence, service, and appreciation. And I won't go into details on that. But so you can see that and as I've taken different leadership roles, I have a formula. It's not, I don't just do the same thing every time. It depends on the situation and the people, but in my mind, I know what approach I'm going to take. That's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and that's important. I mean, the core values are there, the core competencies are there. It's just you have to adapt based on the situation, which you've been very successful at doing. Scotty, I know you do have a question. I just want to check in real quick. Do we have anything from the LinkedIn audience that we want to cover?
Yeah, we actually do. And so I think to your point, Joe, this is a really interesting question. And Drew, feel free to decline to answer if it doesn't make sense to speak to specifics here. But we got a question around the sustainability bond. Basically, this member of the audience says, it'd be really interesting to hear Drew talk more about the sustainability bond, the pros and cons of issuing it versus a common bond. And then what is your biggest learning experience from the issuance?
Yeah, great question. This was 2017. The pros are, frequently when I would talk to treasurers about doing these kinds of bonds, they were looking to have enough, your use of proceeds is ring fence for these activities, right? And they were, as a treasurer, trying to get the business to do that stuff, right? To have to be in an index, you got to issue a minimum of 300 million for, so it's a lot of money, and you want to put that to work relatively soon because you're committing to, providing an annual report to bondholders every year of how you're using their money. And you don't want that out there for 50 years as you're spending $1 million at a time. So treasurers are trying to make sure there's projects lined up to fund. Luckily, in the case of Starbucks, we had there's plenty of things going on. So I didn't have that issue as treasurer, but I could see companies having that. So we were already building, for example, this bond use of proceeds went to supporting all their efforts in the coffee economy. So replanting trees, lending money to coffee farmers, building farmer support centers, and then how they source coffee and all that. That was the green and social part. So that can be a drawback though, but it can also be a convening, can give you momentum to convene people internally to do that. Because once you issue the bond, somehow it gets real once corporate finance gets involved, and all of a sudden people listen. And I found like our public policy team, and Treasury, they, probably hadn't talked a lot in the past. And now all of a sudden we're best buddies, right? And then a year later, we're issuing a report like, here's where we spent the money. And, so it can really reinforce your mission. So that's just a big upside, just from the company's perspective. In fact, our EVP of public policy said, Drew, your bond did more for us in terms of opening doors on Capitol Hill than, 15 years of lobbying, right? Because once finance is, like I said, once finance is involved, it's real for people. On the issuance, there is a scarcity value. it's either, which is bigger, demand or supply. And I think sometimes supply creates demand. And we were in the early days of that. But, I issued a conventional bond at the same time. And, as you drop price in the morning, this oversubscription hung in there on that sustainability bond. So, hard to prove we got a better price, but there is plenty of demand. And anytime you're competing for capital in global capital markets, that's a pretty great thing. Then we took it to Japan, and literally on the roadshow, I had investors ask me, please continue to issue, more of these bonds, because we have this mandate from our, our pensioners and things like that. These are life insurance companies, and their end customers were demanding it. So that's another upside, but it is some more work. It's definitely, you got to have, the projects lined up, because if you don't, it can be painful for the company.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And just to kind of come back to the theme we were on prior to that question, great question again, by the way, Chris. But, talking about your varied background, and not just in finance, but other areas as well, how would you say that expansive skill set contributed to your success as a treasury professional?
Yeah, I'll be the first to say, yeah, I love my time in treasury. I did this little detour, and plenty of people don't really know what treasury does. You're down there in the boiler room, and maybe the tax people are next to you, and we had cybersecurity down with us. And, it was a great experience, and it was eye-opening. Starbucks had a great team. The past treasurer had built a great team, and they were just looking to get involved. So I guess it's one of those roles where you can think it's defined. This is what the treasurer does, or you can view it as a stepping off point to get involved in a lot of different things, even in corporate finance. So I found that there's a lot of people poking around the income statement in a company, right? Everybody's involved in the income statement. You're the owner of the balance sheet, and you're the risk manager of the balance sheet. And treasury is typically a small group. So to me, that translates into lots of opportunity. Having that enterprise perspective just makes it easier to get involved in things, whether it's payments, different types of risk. There's risk everywhere. You guys are treasurers are the professional risk managers. They just may not know about it yet. So the more relationships you have, the more how things come together in the company, the better you can, minimize risk, or frankly, use it as a stepping off point to get involved in more things. At Starbucks, that was like payments. The sustainability bond is an example. I had some background in corporate affairs in my career, and so I was pretty comfortable talking to the public policy people. Maybe I wouldn't have been if I hadn't had that experience. So I think that's how it makes you a better treasurer. And the current treasurer, who Peter Filipovic at Starbucks, who I hired, he'd done 6 years in business development, international business development. And I think that really pays dividends for him. He knows how the international cash flows are moving around Starbucks, which is really important, especially for FX risk and that kind of stuff.
I love that answer. It's extremely important, because what better way to relate to a strategic stakeholder within the business than to have sat in their chair and be able to speak their language and meet them where they're at, right? So we get a lot of questions around, how do I become a strategic business partner if I'm sitting in the treasurer's seat, or if I'm a practitioner? I mean, that's the roadmap right there, is try to diversify your experience, because that's how you become effective.
Yeah.
So along those lines, you touched on what people can expect from you in terms of your leadership style, and when they're a part of your team. What do you look for when you go to hire into your teams? And second part to that question is it soft skills? Is it technical skills? Is it somewhere in between?
I think that it depends on who's on your team. And I don't think you can have all one way or the other. But if I had to lean one way, I certainly it would go more soft skills. And the primary thing, especially for treasury, which is such a, a knowledge worker role, right? Like there's a million ways to do things. You can do it smart, or you can do it how it's always been done. And so what I'm looking for, and what would be looking for in Treasury would be intellectual curiosity. Like I said, there's no right answer, and there's tough topics that you can nod and say, yeah, I understand how that cross-currency swap works or whatever. But I'm looking for the one that's going to be like, I don't quite have it down 100%. I'm gonna nuke this out. I'm gonna take it all the way to accounting entries, and just make sure we're comfortable with that. And I think that makes the biggest difference. And there were a ton of those kinds of people in Starbucks Treasury, which I learned from them, right? Like I'm just saying, hey, what do you need? You're digging into this hard topic we've never done before. What do you need from me? So that's one value that I was really looking for.
Drew, what do you think makes a successful treasurer in the eyes of the C-suite, having sat in that seat?
Yeah, good question. I mean, going back to so many things we've talked about, right? Advisor, being involved in the company, being able to see the strategy and the tactics. But if I had to pull it to one thing, my last CFO boss was Pat Grismer at Starbucks. And the thing I learned from him is elevate the conversation. And that's really hard to do unless you know your topic really well. And there were plenty of times, I'd be talking for 20 minutes and he would sum up everything in about 3 sentences. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. That you nailed it. And whether it's, especially in decks, right? Like he's like, no, we got to pull this up a level, but not lose any of the salient points. Like that's the tricky part, right? To really boil it down to the crux of the issue. And he's excellent at, having 3 high level slides, pluses, equals, really simple equations, whatever. And so I think that's, especially in Treasury topics, right? Easy to get wrapped up in the weeds. You're presenting something, you're getting into basis points, you're getting into new issue concessions, whatever. No, for a board and the CFO, what does this, pull it up a level? What does this mean? Not everything, there's all the benefits, but there's always drawbacks too. And you're the expert at making those balance calls. And because you know how the company works, you're clear on the drawbacks and the benefits, but here's why this is the right long-term, thing for the company, this transaction, this structure, this leverage, whatever. So I think that's what really makes the difference.
That's awesome insight. And just real quick, we're coming up on the last question that Scotty's going to ask. Scotty, I want to check in real quick. Do we have anything else from the audience before we, this will be last call, I guess we'll say.
Yeah, we don't have anything at this moment. I'll hit refresh again before we wrap up to see if there's any additional comments or questions, but nothing that's come through yet. So that, to your point, Joe, the last question that we have for you from our prepared questions today, Drew, how do you see the role of the treasurer changing, particularly with the advancements that we're seeing today and going to continue to see in technology?
Yeah, I think very consistent with what we've been talking about. Treasury is a less is more kind of place. You don't need a ton of people if you've got really well thought out processes. Process first, technology comes later. Nothing's worse than trying to put technology around a broken process and even org structure. So you get your flows right, put the technology into it. So you can be more of the advisor, less mechanics. Treasury has the capacity and time to get involved with stuff. And so I think, that's where it's going, more strategy and advice. And then I would say the world is changing drastically on disclosure. And so we're quickly getting into what used to be, it's kind of a niche. We don't know much about ESG topics, especially around financial disclosure. And as owner of the balance sheet and the investments that companies are making, that's going to be more and more important. And I see Treasury as a key influencer and driver of that. So, one of the things I did, I didn't completely hit the beach during my sabbatical. I did get some certifications and did some, one of the things I did was get my SASB Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting certification, because I was just like, this world is changing quickly. I need to get up to speed. And when BlackRock and State Street, who together probably manage 10 trillion, when they're like, hey, this is important, you need to disclose these metrics. As treasurer or CFO, you should pay attention to that. And that's what they've said. So Larry Fink sends a letter to CFOs every year. And this year he's like, this is what we want. And so I could see Treasury helping drive that conversation, whether it's on the funding side, the investment side, and then knowing the various disclosure standards which are currently in kind of your social impact report. But the more you have those things split from your Qs and Ks, the more at risk you are, I think, of disclosure. So eventually I see that coming together in the Q and K. And the controller and the treasurer can be key drivers of that.
No, that's awesome, and happy to hear that it hasn't just been kicking your feet up during the sabbatical. It sounds like you've still been working and developing there.
I've been doing plenty of kicking my feet up, but I did, gotta keep the brain sharp a little bit. So.
Of course. Scotty, with that, anything else from the audience? All right, cool. Well, Drew, knowing you're in Hawaii, we're going to take you off the hot seat. Thank you so much for joining us. Treasury community, as always, thanks for joining in. Thanks for the questions and interaction. This is part of our Ask a or LinkedIn live chat with practitioners. We will be back on Friday with Ask a Treasurer. And as always, you can catch us on Mondays with Ask a Treasury Recruiter. With that, Drew, aloha. And thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you later.